Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you wouldn't mind taking your seats, please. Good evening. You're all very welcome here tonight. My name is Niamh King. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content here at the Chicago Council. We're thrilled to have Tyler Cowen back tonight, here with Dick Longworth. It should be a great conversation. Some of you may have turned out last February when we had Tyler here in conversation with Randy Krosner on the future of money. And tonight he's in conversation with Dick Longworth on the future of the American dream. So he's into the future. We'll check that out. He's got a new book out. It's right over here called The Complacent Class. It's terrific. Been some great reviews of it. The Self-Defeating Quest for the American Dream. So we're thrilled he's here. A big warm welcome to all of our young professionals that are here. We're thrilled you're out. You have a meetup afterwards that'll take place in the back here, so you're all very welcome. You can stay on for drinks and conversation. Tonight we're on the record and we're being live streamed, but please silence your phones. And we are going to take questions from your phones. Some of you might be familiar already with our Conferences I.O. feature that we have. Listed here will be how you get on through your browser. It's really great fun. chi.cnf.io means our live stream audience can participate too in the questions, but type in your questions there and of course we'll go out to the audience. As many of you know, for nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement with the world. But the views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional views of the Council. A few upcoming programs. March 6th, we've got a great panel on U.S.-Mexico relations under the Trump administration. March 7th, we've got a panel on democracy and insecurity in Africa. We have people coming in from Nigeria on it. It should be terrific. And on March 13th, as many of you know, the Council does a lot of work on global cities. We're thrilled to welcome Anne Hidalgo, who's the mayor of Paris, along with several mayors from other global cities around the world, in conversation with Rahm Emanuel and the Council's own Ivo Daalder. They'll be talking about urban waterways and the global city. Also, I would encourage you to check out a very special half-day symposium we have coming up on April 11th on democracy, whether or not democracy is in retreat. We'll be hosting Arthur Brooks from AEI, Yashka Monk from Harvard, E.J. Dionne from the Washington Post, Larry Diamond from Stanford, a whole host of scholars. It's going to sell out soon, so I would encourage you, if any of those people are of interest to you, to sign up now. It's April 11th. Now let me just briefly introduce our speakers. Tyler Cowen is the Is it Holbert or
Holbert?
Olbert L. Harris Chair of Economics, the chairman of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, the co-author of the blog Marginal Revolution, the co-founder of the online educational platform Marginal Revolution University. He was also named one of the most influential economists of the last decade by The Economist and one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy. And we also learned he's an amazing restaurant picker. He told us last week that his favorite restaurant was a restaurant called Coke's in the Faroe Islands, which I admit I had to look up exactly where they were. And turns out, subsequent to this, they got a Michelin star last week. First Faroe Islands restaurant to get a Michelin star. He called it right there 3 weeks ago. And now our own Dick Longworth, one of the best colleagues in the whole world, distinguished fellow on global cities at the Council of Global Affairs, former foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune for 20 years, distinguished visiting scholar at DePaul University, adjunct professor of international relations at Northwestern University, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, and the author of many books, including Caught in the Middle, America's Heartland in the Age of Globalism. And I can tell you Dick's book, Caught in the Middle, is a superb piece of work that many people think, in light of populism and many things going on lately, has had a renaissance. So I'd encourage you to check that out too, even if we don't have it for sale today. So please join me in welcoming our two fabulous speakers to the stage today. Thank you.
Niamh, thanks so much. Welcome to all of you. Tyler, welcome to Council in Chicago. Welcome back. It's not your first time there. Glad to have you here and to talk about your book, The Complacent Class. It's an odd theme. It's an odd construct here. Let me read a little bit from that you wrote. You talk about a number of main elements driving the trend towards a more static, less risk-taking America. These forces have led to an America that is calmer, safer, and more peaceful, at least in the short run, but it's also an America that is losing the ability to regenerate itself, reinvent itself, and create new sources of dynamism. Now that sounds like a statement about America Decline, which had a popularity about a year ago. But you're calling it complacency. Tell us, what do you mean by complacency? How can this be described as complacency?
I've seen a fundamental shift in the American mentality over the last 15 to 20 years, and I find this mirrored in many different kinds of statistics. For instance, we move across state lines at a much lower rate than we used to. That's down about 50%. We medicate ourselves at higher rates. We're much more reluctant to even let our children play outside. There are schools that have banned the game of tag. The current ideal is to be open-minded, which is admirable, but I actually would prefer people who are hungry-minded or questing in some sense. I think our interest in big ideas and grand projects has somewhat diminished. And if you look at most economic numbers, such as productivity growth, innovation numbers, contrary to what you might hear from Silicon Valley, those are mostly down quite a bit. And so many of the innovations we do have, like Netflix and Amazon, they're innovations that help us stay at home. So we've given up this quest to master and reshape geographic space and have retreated into our cocoons.
How much of this is economic? How much is sociological? You wrote a previous book, The Great Stagnation, that talked about economic stagnation, but you're going beyond that now into society as a whole. Where do the two connect? How much of this is economically driven, do you think?
I think the economic and the sociological forces, they work together. So it used to be in this country, rates of productivity growth would average 2 to 3% a year. Out of the last 4 decades, in 3 of them, the rate of productivity growth has barely been much above 1% a year. So that lowers opportunities, that restricts upward mobility, be it economic, social, educational, whom you can marry, and that in turn feeds back to attitudes, and that feeds back again to economic forces. The non-complacent class in this country, actually, it's immigrants, because they come here full of ambition, realizing they will have to adapt or move around a great deal. But overall, I do witness this slowing down of our national spirit, and that reflected in some quite concrete magnitudes.
Well, by putting limits on immigration, trying to send back the immigrants we've got and prevent new ones from coming in, are we really shooting ourselves in the foot on this?
I'm not a fan of the plan to send back immigrants. I do feel there's something broken in legally how we treat immigrants and how we enforce the law. And I would much rather we proceed with a sensible immigration reform where we would take in more skilled and more unskilled immigrants. President Trump talks about wanting 4% growth. You can't do that by sending people away. You've got to bring people in and include them in some manner. So one of my hopes for this country is that we do still have a dynamic heritage. I feel most Americans actually are still accepting of immigrants. If you look at poll data, are immigrants good for America? That's actually a very mild slope upwards. And that's one of the things that gives me hope, even though a lot of the headlines are a tiny bit gloomy.
Now, in stagnation, Robert Gordon from Northwestern has been here, and he's talking about his concept of stagnation, the fact that we just aren't innovating, or rather we are not coming up with transformative innovations like electricity and the combustion engine, the jet plane, things like that really changed how we live. And we've run out of transformative innovations, which is slowing down our productivity, and will continue to do so far in the future. Are you a Gordon fan, or is there more to it than this?
I mostly agree with him, but I see it a bit differently in a few ways. First, I do think we have some transformative innovations very recently. They just tend to be calming and things that keep us at home. So take Facebook, or take the knitting together of really the entire world through a network of smartphones at our fingertips. They help us match, say, to whatever music we want to listen to in the moment. That's quite remarkable. I think it's a mistake to dismiss it, but I think there's also a problematic side to those innovations, that very often we use them to be more comfortable. Take your incredible ability to access music. The net result of that is people are spending a lot less time and money on new music. So we're being less dynamic, less creative, producing music for the future. So there's a double-edged side to this comfortableness. And I think Gordon actually is too pessimistic. He's convinced this will last forever. There'll never be a new fundamental innovation. And I find that extremely unlikely. I just think it will take a long time and will be very painful along the way.
So much of the innovations we have now are simply enabling us to do faster what we already could do, not to do something different.
That's right, like Uber, which I'm a fan of and I use, but it's a more efficient taxi. That's nice. It's not really a big deal. If you took it here, wonderful, but you could have taken a cab at maybe slightly higher price and you would have had to wait a bit longer, but it's not changing people's lives.
Let's talk more about this matching. You talk about that quite a lot in the book. Bill Bishop wrote the book several years ago, The Big Sort, into how we are sorting ourselves into like-minded communities to the point that we don't have to talk to anybody who doesn't look like us or who doesn't agree with us. You get into this, I think you take this somewhat further, the matching, people marrying each other, finding each other, deliberately going out instead of serendipity is out and planning is in a way. Could you talk more about that?
That's correct. So if you take the area of marriage as an example, there's much more assortative mating going on. So it's far more likely, say, that two partners in a law firm will marry each other. That didn't happen in an earlier America. For one reason, there were many fewer female partners. So overall, on net, it's actually a good thing that more assortative mating is possible. People are marrying those they want to. I think for people who are well educated, you see it in the data, rates of divorce are down, marriages seem to be happier. So a lot of positive development. So I'm not here to preach doom and gloom, but, and there's a big but, the more we match to each other, the word matching, it's so positive. Oh, I found my wife online, or, here's my internet group. Matching is the other side of the coin of segregation, and along many metrics, whether it's racial, by income, or by education. There are worrying trends in this country of segregation going up again, and the dreams of the civil rights movement are to some extent being forgotten. And I think it's important to point out that's not just there's some evil people out there we need to defeat. It's that the very things we feel good about when conducted in the aggregate also in some ways give rise to more segregation.
How did we get here? I mean, Americans think of themselves as adventurous, entrepreneurial, we're pioneer spirit, all that sort of stuff. We're not supposed to be complacent. We're supposed to be active, probing. What happened? How did we get to this complacent state that you're describing?
I think the American tendency is to be somewhat self-congratulatory in the first place. And this motivates us. But again, like all motivating forces, it's a little worrisome. And we're also used to comparing ourselves to Western Europe. And we are still more dynamic than Western Europe. But that to me is a fairly low bar. I think of my book in some ways as writing how a Chinese person today might view America. And then we're really not so dynamic at all. But how did we get here? I think it's at least two forces. One is the kinds of technologies that are new tend to encourage complacency. Some of that is simply accidental. What was invented before? What else? So easy to stay at home and view on Netflix. There are people who will only watch streaming movies on Netflix because it's too much trouble to send the discs back and forth. And most of the great movies of the world, you can't stream them. You can get them on the disc. But people sit at home, they just want to click with the remote and do the streaming, and that we've denied ourselves the world's most fantastic cinematic heritage because we're too lazy to mail the disc, and Netflix even pays for that. That, to me, is an example. It's a small one, but it illustrates that complacency. And here's the historical factor. In this country, the 1960s up through the mid-70s, it was a time of great turmoil, violence, protest, riots. It was very uncomfortable. And we decided we would fix that, lower the crime rate. We did many good things in response to those excesses. But I think we also took it too far. And the logic of safety has a momentum of its own. Just try building wind power near some upper middle class neighbors. Build some wind power turbines where someone can see them from their home and see how easy that is. If you recall the Great Selma Civil Rights March of 1965, they marched down an interstate highway. The highway was shut for 5 days, and no one said NIMBY. Of course people were inconvenienced, but that march happened. That is not the America we live in today.
Yeah, the book seems to have a bit of nostalgia for the riots of yesteryear and the good old days of the Vietnam protests. I don't think that's what you have in mind, but is it what you have in mind? Was there a spirit there that we've lost?
I don't like the riots, of course, and nor did I ever do one, should add. But there's something about campus life that's very different. So some number of decades ago, for instance, we had something called the New Left, and it was the strongest supporter of free speech and free speech on campus that this country had. Today, the progressive movement, it's more about safe spaces, and at times it's an enemy or opponent of free speech. The notion that, a clash of ideas, that it would hurt some feelings, but give the chance for a greater truth, and that we would take chances with this kind of dialogue, that is now weaker in American life. So we veer between like the super safe dialogue where people are afraid to say things, and then like the super nasty on Twitter and social media where people say everything to each other, where it's just horrible. And somehow that middle ground, I see us moving away from, not toward. And that we had more in the 1960s.
Now you do talk about the upside of the protest movements and things like that. The book was written just before Trump was elected, and there's been a terrific amount of protest since then. Do you see this being revived? Has the Trump election changed it? Has it shaken us out of complacency, do you think?
I don't think we know yet, and just to be clear, I did not predict that Donald Trump would win. An earlier draft
you
of
predicted a Trumpish moment, that
5 or 10 years from now.
That this complacency couldn't last forever.
That's correct, but the world was ahead of me, so to speak. And so the moment of political disruption and some aspects of political dysfunction, I would say, have come now. I'm not sure I can predict what the Trump presidency will look like, but here's my opinion in the moment. I think Trump will be what I call the placebo president. It will be a lot of rhetoric, short on execution, not understanding the levers of government, or having the personal or political connections to staff a bureaucracy to carry out the program. And people will sort of feel something's being addressed because of all the noise. But the vision to me, so often it's backward looking. So there's all this talk about repairing the bridges and the tunnels, which, by the way, I'm for. But when the first point you make is let's repair the bridges and the tunnels rather than let's build the smart grid or let's fix America's educational problems for everyone, that to me is backward looking. The idea of a nation with higher tariffs, fewer immigrants, and less reliance on foreign allies, that's the Eisenhower administration. And with all due respect to Ike, I don't think that's a workable vision for our future.
I think a lot of us, though, feel that the election of Trump and the backlash to it is changing the nation, is going to change it fundamentally. You're indicating that it's going to be the sort of placebo administration and with nothing much happening, and the complacency will carry on, that Trump won't shake us out of this.
I'm a little more pessimistic than that. So I think
Glad to hear it.
I think it's quite possible that domestically he's simply a very ineffective president. There are a lot of checks and balances, and I've seen no signs that he and his people can fight through those to advance their agenda. Obviously, there's a lot of time left in the game, but those are the early signs. But foreign affairs, which is not what my book is about, but it's a very different story. And I think the simple unpredictability at the very top will fray a lot of our foreign alliances, and that could be very harmful. That's what I'm afraid of, really, is the external element. This gets back to the mission of the Chicago Council. But there are many fewer checks and balances on a president there. And even if he doesn't, quote unquote, do anything wrong, the very fact of that unpredictability, the Japanese, South Koreans, Mexico, they all start saying, hey, we can't count on this country. But I see domestically voters are very complacent about that. They don't care enough about America's broader role in the world. And there's plenty of hatred or dislike of Trump, but I think most of it is actually not even directed against the most relevant issues, and that's our global standing.
Foreign policy has always been kind of an elite preoccupation. The post-World War II order was set up by the wise men, a bunch of men who could basically meet around a lunch table. The neocons during the Bush administration, same way. Foreign policy is an elite preoccupation with most people, as long as they trust the president, going along with it. Have our elites become equally complacent?
Not all elites are created equal, I would say. So I think within the Trump administration, you have elites like Steve Bannon who are not complacent, but not all non-complacency is good, right?
Yeah.
So this mix of the lashing out and the lack of understanding on execution, I think is still what we're seeing. And you're seeing it, with Sessions and Flynn, and almost every day there's a story, a mix of lurching and then retreat, and then losing control of the media narrative. And, I don't think that's what will bring collapse or fascism to this country, but I don't see it as a good time for America's role in the world.
The people who framed American foreign policy over the years, like the people who invented the European Union, they shook things up, but they had vision, which is something else again. Vision would seem to be the enemy of complacency and vice versa.
Our founding fathers had vision. They understood the power of ideas. Their ideas were actually fairly new ideas. They drew upon antiquity, the history of the Swiss Republic and other places. But they were fundamentally radical. Thomas Jefferson owned a Quran. He thought that Islam made more sense than Christianity. You may or may not agree with that. But these were people willing to embrace truly different and radical ideas. And it wasn't about how to stop change. Go back and read the debates on, the Northwest Ordinance of the 1780s. The extent to which people understood they were building something truly significant and amazing, you just don't see anymore today.
Let me go back to something you mentioned a few minutes ago, that the innovations and technology we have now encourage complacency. I suspect the people get the innovation and technology they deserve or they want. So I'm going back to the character here of people. Are Americans simply, what's the word, stodgier, or is it something more than that? Is it a fear? Is that a factor?
I think there's fear, there's a desire to hold on, there's having witnessed the crash and the Great Recession. I think also, depending on your age, if you're an American or a migrant whose formative experiences are the 1980s and 90s, it's a fundamentally misleading view of this country, that our past has much more turmoil. And I think the longer a historical perspective one has, actually the easier it is to be optimistic. Because in this country, times have been much worse. But the 80s and 90s, those are decades where there are remarkably few bumps. And globally, everything seems to be moving in the right direction. And that spoiled us. So I think a lot of the complacency is that we got spoiled by our own successes. Bravo to us, those were real successes. And we've lost sight of the bumps. And now we're trying to pretend the bumps aren't there. But I think the last election, whether or not you favor or oppose Trump, it's now hard to run away from this narrative. And you were pushing it in 2009. You're so far ahead of the curve on this. For those of you who don't know, he wrote a great book about problems in the Rust Belt in the Midwest. But now there's hardly anyone who denies the bumps. But we don't yet seem to be in the problem-solving mode. And I think eventually we will get there.
Yeah, I've discovered that back in 2009, I was talking with a lot of Trump voters and I didn't know it.
That's right. I read a column by Malcolm Gladwell from the mid-1990s when he was a reporter for The Post. I was interviewing him and doing prep. And he wrote a column about Pat Buchanan, who of course didn't win. But if you sub in the two words Donald Trump for Pat Buchanan, Malcolm could publish the same column today and it would be heralded as brilliant and prescient.
But the people, at least as far as we can tell from the polls and all that, the conventional wisdom is that the people who voted for Trump, who voted for the past, as you say, are people who are hurting. They aren't happy with their lives. They come from places, old industrial cities and rural areas that are declining. They worry about their own lives. They worry about their children's lives. It's not a way, they don't seem to be complacent about the present so much as rebelling against it.
Well, if you look at lower middle classes in this country, I think in some regards there is less of a sense of urgency than there used to be. So young men, for instance, they're much more likely to live with their parents than was the case a few decades ago. The drug of choice is a soporific drug like marijuana or maybe opiates rather than cocaine, which hops people up. It might be better, actually, I don't know. But even our drugs are reflecting our complacency. The extreme popularity of computer and video games amongst the unemployed, the quest for disability income, and many people genuinely need it, but some others don't. And I think how people are reacting to adversity is more cocooning than was the case in earlier decades in this country, even in the lower middle classes. Mm-hmm. And note, not all Trump voters are hurting. In the Republican primaries, according to exit polls, the typical Trump supporter had an income of $71,000 a year. Now, it depends where you live, how good that is. But Trump phenomenon is quite broad, and I think much of it is about cultural control, the mourning of a passing of some vision of an earlier America that I'm not sure ever even existed. But there's plenty of well-off people who voted for Donald Trump, right?
Middle class, 71,000, let's say, people who have made it, but may not be quite sure that they've made it, holding on by their fingernails. They're going back to this fear factor. These aren't people that are on the breadline by any means. They've got something that they're afraid to lose.
When I write my Bloomberg columns, which I'm assuming through the Bloomberg terminals have a pretty wealthy readership, a significant portion of my readers are extremely pro-Trump. So I think there's also a sense among wealthy people that this country has failed, it's less fortunate, and they see that kind of change as a potential remedy. And it's a pretty deeply rooted phenomenon. I think we see those kind of ideas in America's history for centuries. So in that sense, to me, the only surprise is that we were also surprised. And that's because we were spoiled by the 80s and 90s, where we just would hit like triple or home run after the next.
This is a national problem. You're speaking here in Chicago here now. What about in the cities? This does seem to be increasingly two nations, this great red landscape with a few blue dots, and Chicago's one of the blue dots. Does this complacency span this border? Do you find the same sort of complacency in cities that should be more dynamic, but maybe aren't?
Until the 1970s, the pattern in America as a whole is that the poorer cities would catch up to the wealthier cities. They wouldn't necessarily equalize, but they would grow at faster rates. And that has stopped altogether. Now, if anything, the wealthier cities are pulling away. So obviously San Francisco, Silicon Valley, New York City, many other places like Austin, Atlanta, places where large parts are doing fine or great. But the cost of living there is higher. It's much harder to move into those cities. If you look at popular culture post-World War, there are so many stories of, a fellow, he'll move to New York and just move into a flop house. It might be on Broadway or Fifth Avenue. There'll be a guy with basically no assets. He just pays rent by the week, gets a job washing dishes, tries to work his way up, may or may not succeed. But it's inconceivable today to think you could just, move into some kind of pad on Broadway in Manhattan and try to work your way up. It costs way too much. So I think we've so improved our best cities, but let other cities lag, and the best ones are now so expensive. There's something not working about the overall urban arrangement. And then within many of these cities, there's often more segregation, certainly by income and sometimes by race. So that to me is somewhat broken.
Well, that's a sort of a complacency in itself there. We're in the cities, we've got ours. The rest of you can stay out. We have these gated cities. We have a reluctance to shake things up too much.
And Chicago in particular, whereas all of you probably know better than I do, There has been an increase in violence in recent times, but there's plenty of parts in the city that if that's where you are, you're still absolutely fine. And so the urgency of addressing that problem is somewhat circumscribed.
We pride ourselves, and I think all cities do, on the rate of change here, on entrepreneurialism, on new businesses. We have these incubators that are spinning off these ideas, new jobs, new ideas, bang, 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 a very dynamic economy here. But you say in the book that that's not necessarily true, that the rate of change actually is slowing down, and I assume since cities are the engines of change, cities are slowing down too.
Here's a very simple metric. If you look at the median male wage in 1969, it's a long time ago. The Mets won the World Series in 1969. We only passed that in US Census data in 2015. So think of the current median wage as basically being where it was in 1969. Now there's some measurement problems in those numbers. I don't think they count like the value of free Google adequately. But that is even possible in the numbers. Imagine going back to 1969 and saying to American economists or just plain ordinary Americans, our leaders, oh, when we get to 2016, 2017, the average man is going to be earning no more than today. Everyone would have thought you were crazy. And if you said we're still going to be flying a plane from 1970 and almost everyone's travel time will be slower, we're going to dismantle our bus network and trains won't get any better, and no flying cars, by the way. It's not what anyone expected. And I think that's indicative of the fact we're wonderful at accelerating the transmission of information, but we've too much specialized in that realm, and we've let too many other problems slide.
That's so interesting that all this has sort of, why you see a lot of this 1979 being kind of the date, 69, 79, that era in there. Suddenly things stopped. The rise in income stopped, wages stagnated, so much slowed up. Why then? Was there something going on then that caused this?
I think there are many different factors, and economists and historians still debate this. But I think one neglected factor is just we hit a kind of threshold. So think of a lot of the 20th century as being about combining powerful machines with fossil fuels. And then we did everything possible with those technologies and electricity. There was radio, then there was TV, there was the car, then there was the plane. And we explored that space. The electric oven in your kitchen. But at some margin, cars, they only get so much better. So my car today, my car when I was a kid, is a little better. The tires don't get flat as often. It has side airbags. My sound system is better. It's still a car. You could put me back in my old car. I could drive it. You could put the old me into my current car. I could drive that. I wouldn't need to ask any questions. So the old technologies, we did what we could with them. I do think there's a new wave of breakthroughs coming, contra Robert Gordon. They just take a long time to evolve. And in the meantime, we all feel a bit stuck.
The old you in the new car may have had a little trouble figuring out how to work the radio, but otherwise things work okay.
I have satellite radio in my car, and I just talk to it. And the old me in that 1974 Plymouth Valiant really would have been baffled.
But we're getting the transportation, and most of this was carbon fueled. I wonder how much the two oil shocks, 1973 and 1979, had to do with this.
Those are significant
suddenly
factors.
Putting on the brakes. On
Absolutely. Also factors. But note that even when the price of oil fell again, as it has, and today, that helped a bit, but it didn't fix things. So I think it's a multiplicity of factors, sociological, psychological, economic, historical, interacting. Some of it's just some bad luck. And here we are.
Now you can maybe blame this on the aging society, and us old guys, we're less adventurous. But I told some of the millennials in my office that you say that even the millennials are very complacent. They were highly offended to hear this because they think of themselves as zippy. But what do you mean by this? You make this case.
Data on business startups, again, maybe that's not the best measure. Millennials are not phenomenal in that regard. I don't mean to blame them at all. if you come of age in the Great Recession and tuition is much higher and your possible student debt is much higher, it's not your fault if you don't have the resources to, start the next Facebook or do whatever. But I feel due to, opportunity being lower rather than any kind of moral defect of the millennials, it's clear in the data you have a generation that, stays longer at home. And some parts of the millennials really do seem less ambitious, and they're much less likely to have the expectation they will do much better than their parents. Whereas in earlier Americas, we had that expectation for a long time, and part of it, drove people. So the most ambitious millennials seem to me, again, to be immigrants.
What does this mean for America's ability to compete in the world? I remember the first time I went to China, and you just sort of got the feeling, I said, this is an ambitious society. Mm-hmm. Then I got to thinking, when was the last time you could call the United States an ambitious country? There is a sense of drive and dynamism, often quite crude, noisy, thrusting, kind of like late 19th century
Absolutely.
Chicago. But you do feel that there, and you don't feel it here. What does this mean? Are we so far ahead? Are we so good at things that we don't have to worry about this too much, or is this a real danger?
Well, I think it's a real danger. Sometimes people ask, well, can't we just, stay put? That's very hard to do. So systems tend to ossify or become too complex or be captured by interest groups. Systems also tend to take on a lot of debt. So state of Illinois has a lot of debt, unfunded liabilities, our federal government, a lot of homeowners during the Great Recession. And we rely in part on dynamism to pay off that debt, to keep on handing out goodies to interest groups, so a bit, they go away and leave us alone and allow growth to proceed. And if we don't have that stream of dynamism, I don't think you can just stay put. At some point, you start running in reverse. And you see countries, say like Portugal on a very small scale, or Greece, been more chaotic. But real wages there have been running in reverse for a while. The notion that you can have a mature economy where for decades wages are falling, we're not used to that. It's not this country yet, but at least for typical male earners, we're very close to that. And also, I think the political reaction you get from that is not always helpful.
For some male earners, certainly for the high school dropouts, aren't the wages going down?
Yes,
you're getting the other social pathologies to this, including lowering longevity.
I've never seen a full accounting of how much of our economic growth of the last 40 years has resulted merely from women being better educated, working more, and facing less discrimination. I fear how large that number would be. So, that's been a very dynamic source, very non-complacent source for this country. It's not that everything's completely complacent. But we've been riding on that, and the notion that women will increase their work as much as they have over the last 40 years, over the next 40 years, no one thinks that's going to happen, right? The progress made in those dimensions. So we've been getting a bit of a free lunch there. It's not going to continue.
Robert Reich makes the point that we increased productivity these past 40 or 50 years, first through bringing women into the workforce,
right,
up to the point where we've probably got as many as we're going to get. Mm-hmm. As many women are working as want to work. So the second thing we did was we worked harder and we worked longer. Americans generally work, they say, about an average of a month per year longer than other people.
That's right.
But sooner or later you got to sleep.
Sure.
So we couldn't do that. So then we borrowed, and we learned in 2008 where that gets us. So there's no other source of productivity, vitality, and energy.
Well, immigrants are one. There's an enormous free lunch. And admittedly, there are political problems and even significant social problems. But nonetheless, on net, that's one of the remaining sources of low-hanging fruit, is for a country to take in more immigrants and, do it better rather than worse. And I still think of the countries in the world, the United States, Canada, and Australia have probably done the best job, and we're still in the top 3 there. And that's one of the biggest reasons that gives me hope and ultimately puts me in the optimist camp.
Do you go to Canada much?
Oh, at least once a year, often 2-3 times a year.
Okay, you know, the immigrant situation, Toronto is more than 50%
Correct.
immigrant. When I'm up there, I do get the feeling of a dynamism. Maybe this is it. Does Canada suffer from the same sort of complacency you're talking about? It's a society so similar to ours.
I feel Canada has been on this wonderful 20-year roll, and it has become much better, nicer, more interesting country without really losing much, if anything, in the way of basic freedoms. I worry a bit how much of that has come from resource wealth. So China buys some quite significant things from Canada that they don't buy from us so much. So as Chinese growth slows down, as it is doing and must do, Canada will lose that extra edge. And you look at the longer run history, Canada and the United States track each other pretty closely. So I'm not sure there'll be a big divergence in the medium term.
I'm just wondering if this emphasis on pro-immigration has given them a boot. That
of course. Montreal also, a city where immigrants, there's less gentrification in Montreal, more mixing of income groups. Obviously Vancouver, Australia, again, a country on an amazing 20-25-year roll, no recession for decades. Everything there going in the right direction.
Is there any place in Europe that is dynamic? You mentioned that they still have lower mobility there than we do. The statistics I've seen is that our social mobility actually has slowed up, and any number of European countries have greater mobility. That is, if you're born poor, you've got a greater chance of rising to the top.
There are different ways of measuring mobility. Typically, if you measure income mobility, the US looks quite poor and Western Europe looks much better. If you measure mobility in terms of wealth, the US looks quite a bit better and Western Europe looks much worse. So a lot of these countries, when you look at wealth, which arguably matters more than income, it gets reversed. I'm not sure there's a single correct way of measuring mobility, but also many parts of Western Europe elevate fewer immigrants than the US. Not all parts. Is there a truly dynamic part of Western Europe? The city of London, if you would count that. But they too are, have rebelled. Their country has rebelled against globalism.
Well, the rest of England rebelled against London.
Absolutely.
To cut off this source of mobility and vitality.
Too much imbalance in the country as a whole. And now there's still an issue with Scotland, of course, and the two Irelands.
The book's been out now, what, a couple months?
No, it came out Tuesday. This is Friday.
That recently. I've been reading reviews. And what have you been hearing? I think a better question is there something you would have written differently or something you would have put in that you didn't think of then that you realize now after it's come out?
Well, I might have had more on Trump, but I also think the notion of a book that only mentions him in passing but is about the ideas behind what has happened. I hope that's refreshing to some people who maybe already get their OD of Trump. But the more talks and interviews one does, I always come back to this question, like, how complacent am I? And the dedication in the book, the beginning it says, this book is dedicated to the rebel in each of us. And I was actually kind of poking fun at myself a bit. And I've developed what I call a complacency quiz. It's going online soon. Like, when was the last time you moved across state lines? When was the last time you switched jobs? How many of your friends have more or less your level of education? And this quiz gets graded. I'm not sure I should tell you all what my score is, but I like to think of this book in part as like a critical re-examination of myself and asking, like, do I have the appropriate sense of urgency? And maybe writing a book is like an incredibly complacent thing to do about complacency. So
well, it depends how many you've written, and you've written a lot.
That's correct. So, another book. It's a form of complacency too. So what I can do to stay fresh and not get complacent talking about complacency, that hits me. Like, the more events I do, more talks I give. I don't know what the right answer is.
Well, what should we do? I mean, we can't all get up and move to another state or move to another city.
It's individually rational to be complacent often, right? That's the problem.
Okay, but if you have a whole nation that is complacent, again, it's a common solution that doesn't do the commons any good.
I've lived in Northern Virginia for 27 years. From that, you can infer my score. And I've been quite happy there. So,
What should people do, though? How can we shake ourselves out of this?
obviously, it depends on your situation in life, and the answer is different for everyone. What I've tried to do personally is do a lot of strange types of travel. So I wrote a book based on doing field work in a very poor Mexican village. That changed my life a great deal and has still affected me. The last significant trip I took was to Lagos, Nigeria. People told me, oh, if you go, they'll just kill you walking out of the airport. It's a pretty safe city. I felt fine there. I went all over. I walked around. You do have to exercise some care. You can just get on a plane and go to Nigeria. You will be fine. So I'm trying to do things to challenge myself, challenge my ideas. I'm not saying everyone is in that same position, but I think in general, behavioral economics shows there's what's called status quo bias. So I'd say if there's some choice of change you're just thinking of making, just nudge yourself, toward the doing it and say, it's for the good of my country, right?
Is there anything society can do, for instance, to encourage more entrepreneurialism, to encourage more churn in businesses, to encourage people to set up their own business or change jobs, to encourage people to travel more?
Oh, I have a long list of policy recommendations, and I blog these every day at Marginal Revolution. And I'm very happy to give that list to anyone, or you can follow me on Twitter. But I also don't think that's the right question, because I know right now in Washington, no one is listening to me. So to lecture people with the list, I'm not sure it's what I want to be doing now, to understand why there's so little interest in a broad set of ideas where amongst intellectuals I find a lot of common agreement. And this country, so often our governance is not listening. And I feel I want to understand that better. That's part of what led me to write the book. So the list right now is not the main thing. But I would all love to give you the list.
Give us a few suggestions anyhow.
We have too much occupational licensing. It's too hard to build wind power. Public and private sectors spend too little on research and development. We need to deregulate building to have more high-density residential housing in our most highly productive cities. Just for a start, that would be 5 things off the bat, where I find people on left and right, they don't all agree. But they're not just, partisan solutions that you must be Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, whatever. Most of those things aren't happening. An America that, dreams big and thinks big again and has like a positive, really forward-looking vision and, again, takes on more tolerance as part of one of its big projects, but in a way that's compatible with freedom of speech. Education, I feel, at various levels is broken. The incentives of academics are far too conservative. I don't mean that politically. I mean literally. People get tenure. Their behavior doesn't change. You've been given a job for life, or if you don't commit a felony, you can do what you want. And there are people, they still work on, very, very small problems and write for like 30 or 40 other people. And believe it or not, actually not all of it is of earth-shattering importance. Academics are among the most complacent class we have. And I would like to see those incentives changed and the whole way we train graduate students. So again, the list is very long, but just reciting the list is at this margin, not the main point.
I wonder if the solution might be best found in cities, maybe not in the nation as a whole, but in cities, where the ideological divisions are smaller. As they say, potholes are non-political. Cities have jobs to do that are fairly immediate, and politics doesn't come into it. Chicago for years has had Democratic mayors that rule as Republicans, basically. There's not that much change, and I wonder if these solutions can be best found in cities where at least you don't have the partisan divide to keep them from happening.
Here's a hopeful fact that I see. In this country, the one part that is becoming more racially integrated is the suburbs. Cities actually are mostly becoming worse. So I'm a little more hopeful about the suburbs, and I confess to being an avid, complacent suburbanite for many years. And you're shaped by where you live. The revenge of physical space is a big theme in the book. And I live right outside of Washington, D.C. It's a highly complacent city where it's a company town, of course. And maybe that makes me a little pessimistic about cities. It's become a much nicer city, but it's not a city solving our problems.
Aren't suburbs more economically segregated, though?
Not anymore, no. In fact, there's a problem with more poverty moving into America's suburbs, and the suburbs not having the civic infrastructure to handle that. Cities have grown so expensive. Poorer, but not very poor people are moving out to the suburbs, and they show up at shelters or want food aid or want some kind of assistance, and the suburbs can't handle that. It's maybe the biggest way our suburbs are failing us now.
Maybe a factor of the cities pricing the poorer people out of town.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, shall we turn this over to the audience? It's been very terrifically stimulating.
Now
Thank
we'd
you.
like to
Thank
go
you.
to the audience. You know the rules of engagement. Please raise your arm, wait for the microphone, and make sure your question's a question. So who will start with? Right here, this gentleman in the third row, please.
Hi, James Lang Henry, millennial. I'd like to start with saying I'm very zippy. My question has to do with climate change and how you think complacency within our society has led to our inability to address the issue in a timely fashion.
We've done very little. The progress we've made has partly been by mistake, so natural gas displacing coal, which of course is good, but it wasn't part of an effort to combat climate change, it just was cheaper and easier. So it's one of the 2 or 3 biggest problems. We're doing basically nothing on it. Trump seems to be setting what little we were doing in reverse, as far as I can tell. We'll see. And I think it's a perfect example of complacency. Many people say it's not a problem for me now. Or, yesterday in Northern Virginia, it was 80 degrees. People were happy. I get why they were happy. I was happy. It was beautiful. But when all you have to say is, I love this weather, that's a problem, and that's where we're at.
Okay, I'm glad to see some continuity in our programming here, because the largest question, the one with the most responses we have is, what is your position on UBI, Universal Basic Income? We just hosted Eno Schmidt, who led the Swiss movement for it a couple of years ago. How does this fit into it, Universal Basic Income, if you think it does, Tyler?
I've thought about this a great deal, and I wrote a book 3-4 years ago where I more or less endorsed the idea. But since then, I've come to conclude I don't think it can work. And some of it has to do with complacency, but I think some of it has to do with immigration. So nations advertise themselves. And my worry is if the United States had a universal basic income, we're putting up a big sign saying, this is not a country of ambition. And I think a universal basic income probably can work in New Zealand, probably can work in Denmark, some number of other places. But I think, or maybe I hope, it's our destiny actually in some ways to be a tougher place, but also to be more dynamic, to produce more innovation for the world as a whole. And the uniquely American federalistic piecemeal, some people do slip through the cracks approach to welfare and redistribution, I've reluctantly concluded probably is necessary. I think we could do it a lot better than we do now. But this kind of mythical, we're just going to pass one law and give everyone a cash check, it's not the way government works in this country. Small, more homogeneous country with more political unity, more ethnic homogeneity, I think it can work. But here, I think we're always going to be complex and messy when it comes to redistribution. Just a fact of life. Let's do it better. But ultimately, the national ethos of this is a place that is in some ways truly challenging, more challenging and higher risk than Western Europe. I would actually rather we kept that.
Thanks. Next question. Yes, right here, please, in the second row. Could you take the mic, please, sir, because we're on live stream. Thanks.
Sorry. One of the things that there was a lot of energy and no complacency about during the election was drain the swamp, and it drove the Sanders and Trump campaigns. And you have a lot of people thinking the game is rigged, and people like Luigi Zingales at the Stiegler Center say, well, we may have passed the point of regulatory capture, and I'm wondering if the complacency might just be a feeling of helplessness about that, or does the rage counter your idea of complacency?
I don't think we'll ever drain the swamp. There's a certain amount of rage, but I think actually a fairly weak sense of urgency. And the quickness with which people will be distracted from drain the swamp to partisan bickering is always striking. And sometimes you need partisan bickering. It's not always a bad thing. I think we will ultimately get out of this by innovating around the swamp, not by draining it. Most swamps in this world remain undrained. Countries slowly, can manage to be less corrupt, and we may manage that. Certainly, Singapore did, and that was once a highly corrupt country, Singapore. Now it's one of the least corrupt. So, but the idea that you come in is almost a vaguely authoritarian tinge to it. In a system of government with checks and balances, there's not a single plug you pull and then things run out through the drain. It's like a slow evolution and turning around and growing out of your old set of problems into a new and hopefully preferred set. And that's what I think we'll manage.
Great. Yeah, the gentleman right here, please, in the second row.
I get your point on drain the swamp, but there's still a political problem in our country that people can't use ideas like you poised today and other smart people do, and they can't come to solutions because they have to hold on to their strong right-wing or left-wing convictions. How can we as a country come with common solutions to fix a lot of problems that have solutions, and we all know what they could be, but no one could get to that point?
I mean, there's a debate in political science and economics. There's like a big swamp. How much of the swamp is the special interest groups? How much is the voters? Clearly it's both. But I guess I'm on the side of that where I blame the voters a bit more and the special interests a bit less. So we're the biggest swamp, right? Right here, the 320 million people in this country, like high swamp. How are we going to drain that? But nations do educate themselves. They actually sometimes learn from history. Our country has a great past record of self-improvement. I don't think we've lost that DNA. We're just, at a down bit in the cycle. So I really look to voters for improvement more than, clearing away all the special interests. Our country has always had those. Our very Constitution was really pushed by special interests who wanted, debts paid off and new taxes and various improvements for good or for bad reasons. Our Constitution's part of the swamp. So I don't want to say embrace the swamp. That's wrong. But somewhat wiser voters could overcome a lot of the problems of the swamp. Cautiously, but seeing the big bump right before us, 20-year time horizon, I'm pretty optimistic.
The lady right there in the fourth row, please, with the glasses.
Thank you. I've had a related topic bouncing around in my head during the duration of the session, and I'd like to put it out there for your comments or comparison. The idea of bowling alone.
Yes.
And that problem seems to have risen in our society along the same timeline as we've become more complacent. And I was wondering if you could connect them, or if you see one as cause or result of the other. It seems that we've become less engaged in the civic sector and public sector, and those who are dynamic are trying to be entrepreneurs, as you
Sure.
said. Is there a relation between those two ideas?
Absolutely, because I think mixing makes for mobility, and we're mixing less. Bowling, one of many, many examples. I had lunch with a woman last week, and she said to me, Mormons never bowl alone. Now, I'm not well informed about Mormon bowling, but I do find it striking that measures of religiosity are somewhat down in this country. Not a great deal, but trending downward. And I wonder if that isn't part of the same problem. And on this, I'm as guilty as anyone. I consider myself a non-believer, but a lot of American dynamism has come from religion. A lot of American mixing at times has come from religion. And if religion gets weaker in this country, I'm not sure that's a good thing.
I have a question here, Tyler, from the conferences IO that I think relates a little bit. Where would recent movements such as Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, and #LoveWins and others fit into your argument?
Those are a very diverse set of movements. The one I'm the biggest fan of is Black Lives Matter. I think it's getting at issues of segregation and differential treatment by police, and the fact that not all Americans enjoy the rule of law. I think when it comes to civil rights, since the mid-1990s, I'm not even sure if I've seen in this country progress on net. If you look at, say, the metric of wealth catch-up, that seems to have stopped or maybe gone in reverse. I don't know of really systematic data on treatment by police, but I think anecdotally at least you could make a case that that has gotten worse or at least not improved. So I hope that's the beginning of a reversal of complacency. Occupy Wall Street, there's a section in my book on that. I think in terms of the ideas, there's some good, there's some bad in there. But what I found striking is how much the police in the city of New York kind of shut down those protests just by bureaucratizing them, regulating them, waiting for the winter to come. As far as I see it, in some key ways, that's gone away. I don't think it will be a major force moving forward. I think what will be a major force is various racial issues, issues of tolerance, issues of rhetoric from our leaders. I think there's a chance we're on the verge of some healthy protest activity re-emerging in this country of a kind we haven't had for a while. I'm not sure, I don't really want to offer a prediction, but I see a lot of, budding green sprouts, so to speak. I hope it, takes a turn for the better.
Thanks. Next question. Yes, the lady right there, please, right next to you. Thanks.
Crane's Chicago Business, when they publish their 40 under 40, so many of them are immigrants or
Yes.
first generation. The other day, I Googled Trudeau's cabinet, and the photo was, I suggest you all do that. It looks nothing like our cabinet. A banker around Rush Street told me that the restaurants there are down because people get sucked into the computer. You used to go to the corner bar of the restaurant, see who's there, hang out, exchange ideas. Before they know it, it's 9 p.m. and they're not going anywhere. And when you talk about complacency, there are businesses I used to go in where you'd hear the phone ringing and young people would be running around, old people, everyone. Now they're sort of sitting there silently emailing the person 4 feet away.
Mm-hmm.
Energetically, that can't help. So what are the solutions?
There are some similar examples in the book about matching and the obsession with information rather than physical space. I think just in individual lives, make a kind of vow to limit how much of this you do. So even small things, like I've made a vow lately, when I go to new restaurants, my strategy will be to pick a neighborhood, simply walk along the street and choose a place. I have vowed not to use Yelp anymore. And Yelp is great. I'm a fan of Yelp. I really don't mean to speak against Yelp. But there's something where when you're going to the place that everyone else has recommended online, it's a little unhealthy for the system as a whole. When you refine your intuition, let the spaces you live in shape your life more. It's my feeling I've actually discovered new and better places using this method. I've learned more, come in contact with more people, thought more about the question, if I'm looking for a restaurant, is it more important that I know a lot about food or more important that I have a good sense of whom to ask? And I've actually concluded it's the latter. The best people at finding food can know nothing about food if they can figure out whom to ask in a given social setting. And that's a more important skill. I know it's a tiny, tiny, tiny thing, won't have a big social impact, but if enough people make that kind of small decision in enough small spheres of their lives, we can start to, undo some of the excesses of information society. I would start very small and work up from that.
I would encourage you all to check out some of the movie and restaurant recommendations that Tyler has on his blog. They are not conventional, let's put it that way. What about some of our young professionals? Can you put your arms up if you're one of our, right, the lady right behind you there, one of our YPs, thank you.
Thanks. So I am wondering more about the millennial perspective. With millennials taking over the business market and by 2020 being a larger population than baby boomers, what do you think they'll change? What do you see coming out of that? a lot of people are reporting that it will be a post-racial society eventually with millennials being more diverse. I don't know if I believe that's true, but would definitely like to hear your insight on it.
I mean, that's a hard prediction for me to make. I don't think we'll ever have a post-racial society, but I do see millennials as the kindest and most tolerant generation this country has ever had. And I think that will lead to some very good things as they have more influence. And I don't think they'll all just age into grumpy old people. So I'd say it's another reason to be optimistic. You know, I said millennials are fairly complacent, not that entrepreneurial. That's true. But again, I don't think it's any defect in millennials. Their opportunities have been thwarted, and I think they will, as a generation, grow into something pretty impressive, I think is my sense.
Okay, now a middle-aged amateur maybe. Mike, what about you? Not that I'm accusing you of being that right there. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for being here. How is your talk any different if we were having this in a Rust Belt town, in small town America where, you know, the mills closed or the factories lost a lot of jobs? Sound any different?
I speak in many, many different places, including in China and many countries of the world. The last time I gave a talk in Ohio, I guess you'd call it Rust Belt where I was attacked for being, you know, far, far too optimistic. And I took that lesson to heart. So I think I would focus on a very different set of issues. I would talk much more about foreign trade, where opinions on it would be more mixed than in a city such as Chicago. I would talk more about statistics on income growth. I would talk more about history of opioids, what we might do on that. It would be a very different talk. And there's a sense in which me from DC area, you all in or near Chicago, our worlds are pretty alike, actually, in the broader scheme of things. And I don't feel that way in the Rust Belt. I was recently, a week ago, in Troy, Alabama, which is near Montgomery. Not the Rust Belt, but again, nothing like where I live or usually give talks. And you know, I try to make all my talks different, actually, stress different points, and to like ask myself, what can I learn? There was something I tweeted today, because I heard it from someone else, and she said to me something like, over-preparation is so often an excuse to stop listening. And that really struck me. I thought, like, wow, that's like the best thing I've heard today. And when giving talks, I don't mean that I don't prepare or take it seriously, but I try not to like come in like, here's what I'm going to tell you. I try to make the talk somehow like part of my ability to engage rather than a reason to stop listening. And I would try to, or have tried to carry that to Rust Belt talks too.
Dick, would you have asked different questions if you were in that field? No? The Rust Belt, a different audience?
I'm sure I would have. I would have asked questions reflecting the interest, the day-by-day interest of the people in the audience, which, you know, I think the audience would be different.
Yeah.
I think for the reasons Tyler mentioned.
So a couple of millennial questions on here, Tyler. One more. That's the most popular right now. Is a millennial wrong to think that they won't be better off than their parents? It seems like what got them there won't get me there. So from 9 millennials.
If you look at statistics on income growth, I think the most rational conclusion is that the next generation will, on average, be slightly better off than their parents, but not anything like it used to be in this country. But there's a key qualifier here. Perception is so important. So the people who do better than their parents, they notice it less than the people who do worse, I think. People notice loss more than gain. So collectively as a generation, there will be this feeling we didn't do as well as our parents. I think it's unlikely that's actually what the numbers will show, but it's the kind of country we'll inherit, is a country with that feeling.
Right. Okay. How about right back there in the last row, Nick Brand, please.
Thank you. Some of the things we talked about have painted a dim picture, yet the stock market keeps breaking record highs. But where's the disconnect there?
We debate this a lot, my colleagues and I, some of the journalists I know. I think one reason, not the main reason, but is simply there is more monopoly or market power in the US economy. So that can be good for companies without necessarily being good for the whole economy. A second really significant factor is it is highly likely that Trump and the Republicans cut taxes on corporations. Now, apart from whether or not you think this is a good idea, it will in fact make stocks more valuable. And that too is the single biggest factor why the stock market is up. But I think also the market is judging that Trump, will not be a president who destroys democracy or brings fascism to America or the more extreme predictions. It's not my view either. There's a lot of economic momentum. We're in a recovery phase, and if we have a domestically ineffective president, I don't think the market hates that. So, I think we should listen to the market. We shouldn't uncritically agree with what it's telling us. But it's a serious predictor, just like Super Bowl odds, however wrong they may be. In this last year, in the end of the third quarter, they're worth looking at. So I think the market is saying, America will make it through, but the market is not measuring the bumps and all the human costs along the way either.
Okay, next question. How about the gentleman right here, please, in the fifth row?
Have you ignored, I think, one of the reasons for complacency has been the centralization of power in the United States, whether it's in corporate or media or government, that there aren't that many independent voices existing anymore?
There is a section in my book on monopoly going up somewhat. I didn't cover it in my remarks. But I think if you're just talking about voices, with social media, internet, blogs, Twitter, there are more voices than ever before. I don't worry about that. I do worry about what gets traction and how we polarize and group and match ourselves. But if it's just like, do you have a voice? I've never seen that be healthier. Whether we have the underlying ethical standards to govern a world with free speech where so many people have voices, I think on that we're pretty badly behind. We had an ethics evolved for a world of 3 network TV stations and Time magazine. And now we have, my goodness, and the ethics haven't caught up to the technology.
Tyler, one more from the internet. Why is complacency a better description than entitled?
Entitled is an important word. The word appears in my book. But entitled, I think, involves a moral presupposition, which may or may not be held by people. And I feel that even people who don't feel they're morally entitled to everything they have, they're working very hard to defend it and to, build in their safety and security. So ultimately, I preferred the word complacent. Another early title of this book, it ended up being discarded, but it was a working title for a while, was The Death of American Restlessness, The Decline of American Restlessness. I settled for complacent.
That's your book?
Okay, let's take one last question. How about the gentleman right there in the back, please?
Thanks for being here. My question is, do you believe complacency is a direct result of an overstimulation of technology in the sense that we are all not looking at what we can do, but we're kind of held passively by constantly looking at our phones and then just, okay, that's enough for now, and there's not much that we can do?
Too much comes to us too readily. No, I'm not proposing we either can or should turn back the clock. A Luddite movement to smash all our smartphones. It's not going to get very far. Like who here has deliberately smashed your smartphone? Probably no one. I think what we need to do is work on making other things more attractive, more appealing, more interesting, take more chances. The smartphones are with us. Netflix, streaming is here. But it's not actually the finest things in life. And I think we'll relearn that lesson, but not by moving backwards. It's like, well, now let's leapfrog that with some further, more dynamic innovations. I think we'll do that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Young professionals, you're up in the back. Have a great time chatting and catching up after the program and asserting that you are not complacent by staying out and not being on your phone. Let's give a big round of applause to Tyler and Rick for their
Thank you for your questions. Thank you, okay, thank you.
Tyler's going to be signing the book right over here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you and good night. We're adjourned.